Look, if you've watched my other videos, you know I'm not usually one to go easy on my subjects. I dig into everything, and I don't hold back on the bad, the ugly, and the psychologically messy. But today calls for a different approach, one that honours both the complexity and the humanity of someone we just lost. When someone passes away, it changes how we should examine their life. Today is about understanding, not tearing down. I hope you'll forgive any rough edges in this one. I decided to speak from the heart rather than script everything out, so you're getting my genuine, unpolished thoughts as they came to me. Before we dive into today's analysis, I want to take a moment to honour the memory of Terry Jean Bollea, better known to the world as Hulk Hogan, who passed away last week, July 24th of 2025, at the age of 71. While we'll be examining his complex personality and psychology today, it's important to remember that behind all the larger-than-life personas and public controversies was a human being who brought joy to millions of fans worldwide and helped transform professional wrestling into the global phenomenon we know today. Hogan's impact on popular culture cannot be overstated. He was a pioneer who took wrestling from regional venues to international stardom, inspiring countless people to believe in themselves and follow their dreams. Though his life was complicated, as all of ours are, his legacy as an entertainer and cultural icon will endure. Our thoughts are with his family, friends, and the millions of fans whose lives he touched over more than 4 decades in the spotlight. Today, we'll explore the psychological complexities that made him both fascinating and human. This analysis comes from a place of respect and curiosity about what drives people to achieve greatness, while acknowledging that we all struggle with our own challenges and contradictions. So, what happens when you combine the confidence of someone who truly believes in their dreams with the pressures of living up to an impossible public image? Well, buckle up, because we're about to explore the absolutely fascinating psychological landscape that was Terry Jean Bollea, better known to the world as Hulk Hogan. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another personality analysis, where I attempt to understand human psychology despite never actually finishing my degree. Today, we're diving into the mind of wrestling's most iconic figure, a man who managed to turn charisma into a career and somehow convinced millions of people that optimism and determination could overcome any obstacle. Before we start this respectful psychological exploration, drop a comment and let me know what other public figures you'd like me to analyse. I'm always looking for new subjects to examine thoughtfully, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy these deep dives into what makes people tick. Now, Terry Jean Bollea was born on August 11th, 1953 in Augusta, Georgia, which gives us some interesting context about his background. He grew up in a working-class Italian-American family, the kind where hard work was valued and dreams were encouraged. His family moved to Tampa, Florida when he was young, which probably influenced his later career path, since Florida had a thriving wrestling scene. You might think growing up in this environment would create a humble, grounded individual. What we got instead was someone who looked at his circumstances and decided to dream bigger than anyone thought possible. This is someone who took the concept of self-belief and turned it into an art form. Hogan's early psychological profile shows classic signs of what psychologists call high achievement motivation. Here's someone who was probably pretty good at several things, but his brain decided that wasn't enough. So what does he do? He creates this larger-than-life persona that represents his highest aspirations and most confident self. The fascinating thing about Hogan is how early his natural showmanship manifested. In high school, he was already gravitating toward activities that put him in the spotlight. Wrestling, of course, but also music. Yes, this man had dreams of being a rock star. Picture a young Terry Bollea with a bass guitar, probably wearing something that reflected his unique sense of style and confidence. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. When we look at Hogan's personality patterns, we see someone who displayed what psychologists call grandiose self-concept, but unlike purely narcissistic presentations, his seemed to be paired with genuine warmth and care for others, especially his fans. Let's talk about his wrestling persona for a moment. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a character, it was Terry Bollea's idealized self-image made manifest. Think about it. A heroic figure who always tries to do the right thing, overcomes obstacles through determination, and inspires others to believe in themselves. That's not just character development, that's someone projecting their best aspirations onto the world. The psychological term for this is aspirational identity, and Hogan didn't just have one, he lived it so completely that it became reality for millions of people. He looked at what he wanted to represent and said, "What if I just became this and helped others believe they could be heroes too?" It's like psychological inspiration with a marketing budget. You know what's really revealing about someone's character? How they handle success and responsibility. And Hogan's relationship with fame was complex. He seemed to genuinely understand the weight of being a role model, while also struggling with the pressure of maintaining that image constantly. The man became so identified with his wrestling persona that the line between Terry and Hulk became beautifully blurred in some ways, and challenging in others. This isn't uncommon in entertainment, but Hogan took it to levels that were both admirable and sometimes problematic. He started living the character so completely that it became difficult to separate the man from the myth. And then there's his relationship with authenticity, which can best be described as creatively interpretive. Hogan had this fascinating ability to present his life story in the most inspiring light possible. While some might call these embellishments, they often served a deeper purpose. They were stories designed to motivate and inspire others to believe in their own potential. This is what psychologists call inspirational storytelling, where someone reshapes their narrative to serve a greater purpose. The challenge comes when the line between inspiration and accuracy becomes blurred, which happened frequently with Hogan. You might be wondering about his family dynamics, and that's where we see some really interesting aspects of his personality. Hogan's approach to parenting reflected someone who desperately wanted to be supportive and encouraging. He often positioned himself as the advocate for his children, someone who believed in their dreams and potential. This reveals someone whose core motivation was genuinely caring, even when his methods weren't always perfect. This isn't necessarily problematic, but it shows someone who struggled with setting boundaries because he wanted so badly to be loved and seen as supportive. It's like he couldn't risk disappointing people because his self-worth was tied to being seen as the good guy. And speaking of relationships, let's talk about his marriages and personal life. Hogan's romantic life reflects the challenges that come with maintaining a public persona while trying to have authentic personal relationships. His long first marriage showed genuine commitment, even though it ultimately ended in a very public way. When that marriage ended, it did so in the era of reality television, which meant his personal struggles became entertainment. This represents one of the most challenging aspects of his psychological journey, trying to process genuine human emotions while the world watched and judged. But here's where the psychological analysis gets really meaningful. The man who built his career on being the ultimate good guy, the American hero, the person children should look up to, had a very human shadow side that occasionally surfaced publicly. There were legal challenges, controversies, and moments where the carefully maintained public image showed cracks. Rather than seeing these as purely negative, we can understand them as the inevitable result of trying to be superhuman for decades. When you set impossible standards for yourself, you're bound to fall short sometimes. The most psychologically revealing aspect of Hogan's personality might be his genuine desire to inspire others, even when he was struggling with his own challenges. This suggests someone who understood the power of hope and positivity, even when he couldn't always live up to those ideals himself. This is actually more admirable than tragic. It shows someone who recognized that his platform could be used to help others, even when he was fighting his own battles. Now, when we think about what kind of experiences create this type of personality structure, we see some fascinating patterns. Growing up in a working-class family in the 50s and 60s, especially as an Italian American, came with specific cultural values about strength, determination, and making something of yourself. These aren't inherently problematic values. In fact, they can be quite positive when channeled constructively. Hogan's entire persona reads like someone who took every positive message about believing in yourself and amplified them to inspire others. The muscles, the optimism, the constant encouragement for people to follow their dreams. It all reflects someone who genuinely wanted to be a force for good in the world. The challenge comes when this desire to inspire others gets mixed with personal insecurities and the pressure of maintaining a perfect image. No matter how successful he became, there was probably always that voice asking if he was really worthy of all the admiration he received. The really fascinating part is how success seemed to both fulfill and complicate his psychological needs. You'd think that achieving everything he claimed to want would bring peace and satisfaction. Instead, it created pressure to maintain impossibly high standards, while dealing with increasingly complex personal and professional challenges. This is what happens when your entire identity becomes tied to external validation and inspiring others. Success becomes both a blessing and a responsibility, and like any intense experience, you need to find ways to cope with the pressure. And let's talk about his relationship with aging, because that's where his psychological patterns became both touching and challenging. Here's a man whose entire identity was built on being strong, vital, and inspiring. But time affects everyone, regardless of how determined they are. Watching Hogan navigate aging was like watching someone try to maintain their core purpose while their physical capabilities changed. The continued efforts to stay vital and inspiring, even as his body showed the wear of decades in wrestling, reflected someone who couldn't bear to let down the people who looked up to him. From a psychological perspective, this represents what we call identity persistence, where someone holds onto a core sense of self even when circumstances change. Most people adapt their identity as they age, but Hogan seemed determined to remain the same inspirational figure he had always been. This creates both admirable consistency and practical challenges, where the very thing that made him beloved, his unwavering optimism and larger-than-life presence, sometimes seemed at odds with the natural process of aging and change. And then there were the more serious controversies, the moments where private thoughts became public in ways that were deeply damaging. These weren't just PR disasters. They were human moments where someone's private struggles and less admirable thoughts were exposed to the world. Rather than seeing these as defining moments, we can understand them as examples of how everyone has thoughts and feelings they're not proud of. The difference is that most of us don't have our worst moments broadcast to millions of people. You know what's really telling about someone's character? How they handle failure and criticism. And Hogan's response was often to try to make things right, even when his efforts weren't always perfectly executed. This shows someone who genuinely cared about his impact on others, even when he struggled with his own limitations and mistakes. It's not perfect, but it's human, and it's often more honest than people who never acknowledge their flaws at all. But here's where I want to emphasize something important about Hogan's psychological makeup. Despite all his challenges and controversies, he seemed to genuinely care about making a positive impact on people's lives. His core motivation appeared to be inspiring others to believe in themselves and pursue their dreams. In many ways, his psychological patterns represent a very human approach to dealing with insecurity and purpose. Work hard, stay positive, inspire others, and hope that your contributions outweigh your mistakes. It's not a perfect strategy, but it's understandable and often effective. And let's give credit where it's due. The man was incredibly successful at what he did. You don't become a cultural icon by accident. There was clearly something about his particular combination of charisma, determination, and genuine care for others that resonated with millions of people. Maybe it was because his belief in himself gave other people permission to believe in themselves too. Maybe it was because his refusal to give up felt inspiring in a world that often tells you to be realistic about your limitations. Or maybe it was just because watching someone be that genuinely enthusiastic about life was infectious. Whatever the reason, Hogan managed to turn his psychological patterns into a multi-decade career that brought joy and inspiration to countless people, which suggests that his approach to life, while imperfect, served a meaningful purpose. But the real measure of his psychological legacy might be that he never seemed to find complete peace or satisfaction, not because he was fundamentally flawed, but because he set such high standards for himself and cared so deeply about living up to them. All that success, all that adoration, all those achievements, and he still seemed to be striving to be better, to inspire more people, to leave a positive legacy. That's not psychological dysfunction. That's someone who understood that with great influence comes great responsibility. As Hogan aged and his career evolved, you could see both the benefits and costs of maintaining such an intensive commitment to inspiring others for so many decades. The man who had spent his life encouraging others to believe in themselves was still trying to live up to those same ideals, even when it became physically and emotionally challenging. This is what happens when your life purpose becomes centered on serving others. You don't really get to retire from caring about your impact on the world. When the crowds change and the attention shifts, you're still left with the same drive to make a positive difference, even if the platform is different. In his later years, there were moments where the real Terry Bollea would show through more clearly, usually in interviews where he dropped some of the larger-than-life presentation and seemed more reflective. These glimpses were valuable because they showed the thoughtful, caring person who had always existed underneath the superhuman persona. But those moments were often mixed with a return to the familiar patterns of encouragement and inspiration, because that's who he had trained himself to be for others, even when he might have benefited from just being himself. So what can we learn from the psychological profile of Hulk Hogan? Well, first, that genuine care for others can be a powerful motivating force, even when it comes with personal costs. Second, that the desire to inspire others is admirable, but needs to be balanced with self-care and authenticity. But maybe most importantly, Hogan's story reminds us that we're all trying to figure out how to make a positive impact, while dealing with our own limitations and challenges. Some of us just do it more publicly and with more dramatic flair than others. The man who convinced millions of people that they could overcome any obstacle through determination and positive thinking was in the end someone who was still working on overcoming his own obstacles. He just did it while trying to help others do the same, which is both admirable and deeply human. And honestly, there's something genuinely inspiring about his commitment to encouraging others, even when he was struggling with his own challenges. In a world that often emphasizes cynicism and self-protection, Hogan represented someone who chose optimism and service to others as his life philosophy. So there you have it, a respectful psychological profile of Hulk Hogan, a man who turned his desire to inspire others into a decades-long career that brought joy and motivation to millions of people around the world. While he wasn't perfect, and none of us are, he represented something valuable. The belief that we can all be heroes in our own lives, and that encouraging others is one of the most meaningful things we can do with our time on Earth. Rest in peace to a true original, someone who proved that believing in yourself and caring about others can take you farther than you ever imagined possible. His legacy will live on in everyone who learned to say their prayers, eat their vitamins, and believe in themselves. If you enjoyed this respectful analysis, Make sure to subscribe for more thoughtful explorations of what makes people tick. And remember, when life gets challenging, channel a little bit of that Hogan optimism. Not the over-the-top persona, but the genuine care for others and belief that tomorrow can be better than today. Until next time, keep believing in yourself and treating others with kindness. Peace out, brothers and sisters.